Make sure that pops up. Okay, well, we'll just get started. We'll let a couple more people. Thank you all for coming to Abby's presentation. It's been such a treat having Abby working with us the last 15 weeks. As you all know, most of you work in this office, so have gotten to hang out with Abby and talk with her and get to know her. So you will be missed. But she is here to present today on her research that she's been working on over the last 15 weeks through interviews, reading research documents, and having meetings with industry professionals around North Carolina, South Carolina, and honestly beyond, all over, to come up with some background information on alternative materials for erosion control structures in South Carolina. And some of those most of them have not really been tested in South Carolina. So it'll be all new and interesting to learn. She has created a full research document as well as an abbreviated document that will be sent out with a recording of this presentation by the end of the week. And then she's also created this fantastic one-pager. And those of you that are on Zoom, I'll send that out as well over the email. But we have a one-pager that she created, I think with the audience in mind of land trusts and members of the public who kind of reach out wanting to know a little bit more about living shorelines and kind of where to find the resources. So I think that'll be super useful, especially through some of my conversations with land trusts, where they have a lot of property owners who are interested and just don't know what to tell them. So I will be sending all of this out to everyone else as well to take a look. And with that being said, I will get started and introduce Abby. So Abby, take it away.
All right. Hi, everybody. How's it going?
Good.
I'm going to assume I'm on the camera. I think it's probably facing. That's
Okay.
fine. Cool. So yeah, like Rachel said, I've been working on researching different alternative materials for erosion control and kind of tying that in with living shorelines for South Carolina. So yeah, this is kind of the culmination of what I've been working on this semester.
You can just use the arrow.
Okay, easier. There we go. Okay, so first of all, talking about living shorelines, kind of what are they? How long have they been around? It's been a technology that's been around for a while, and South Carolina's Department of Natural Resources has been doing a lot of research on living shorelines, but essentially the idea came about to restore oyster reefs. So putting out bagged shells or bags full of oyster shells that kind of attract more baby oysters so that it builds up the reefs and restores some of that ecosystem that has been damaged over time. DHEC, the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control, they have a specific definition that they use of living shorelines, which is a shoreline stabilization approach utilized in intertidal wetland environments that maintains, restores, and/or enhances natural estuarine processes through the strategic placement of native vegetation and/or use of green infrastructure. So it's a long definition, but they have to be very specific in how they describe things because of legal reasons. And specifically for green infrastructure, they talk about living shorelines promoting wetland resiliency and water quality, enhance the diverse intertidal habitat. So that rebuilds some of these oyster communities. It also can accrete sediment. So as waves kind of wash over the oyster reefs, it catches sediment behind it and kind of rebuilds the reefs and rebuilds some of that shoreline that's eroding away over time and can help build it up and keep it resilient against sea level rise. Because as sea level rises, all these oyster shells, all these oyster reefs are kind of getting drowned out. So as it accretes, it can help keep them resilient to the effects of climate change and things like that. So it's a really important concept. And let's see, in South Carolina specifically, DHEC has recently, in the last few years, created a critical area permit that's available for property owners. So now not only can DNR make living shorelines on South Carolina shores, but also people just who own waterfront properties can put these out and reap the benefits of that. So these are some of the common materials that are used in South Carolina. Oyster shell bags are like these plastic mesh bags that you fill with oyster shells. You put them out on a reef, kind of stack them, and the baby oyster spat will recruit to the shells and, create a larger reef. Manufactured wire reefs are what they're doing in this picture here. where they take galvanized wire and kind of construct these cages and fill them with oyster shells. And again, the oyster shells recruit baby oysters so that it builds them up. Core logs are more of a temporary solution. They're made of coconut fiber. They're like these big logs of just rolled up coconut fiber. So they biodegrade over time, but they help kind of keep the sediment in place while these other structures are getting more established. Salt marsh grass plantings, those roots help keep the soil in place. And then oyster castles are, I had a picture of those actually in this slide. It'll go back.
Hey
The ones
guys,
on the right. Oh,
I was just wondering if y'all can share the actual presentation through the Zoom. Sorry to interrupt.
Sorry.
Pause.
Technical
Sorry.
difficulties.
I think we can. I thought I had this all figured out. Sorry.
Okay, thanks.
Oh, here we are.
Thanks for letting us know.
Thanks, everyone. Sorry, we can't see the chat either. If everyone, thank you. It's a lot going on. Okay. This would be helpful, wouldn't it? All right. How about that?
Good, thank you.
Great. Thanks, guys, for saying something.
Okay. Yeah, sorry about that. So yeah, oyster castles are these blocks that are produced by a company and they are kind of stacked up and also used as living shorelines. Go back to slide I was on. And then DNR also does recycled crab traps. These are not they're used, they essentially take old crab traps that have been abandoned or been left out, and then they use those and fill them, they coat them in concrete. That way you have these like wire crab traps, they're coated in concrete. That rough surface also helps recruit oysters really well. So these are kind of some of the things that have already been tested in South Carolina and pretty commonly used. But a lot of these methods use recycled oyster shells, and DNR has the recycling program that they do. But we are facing a bit of a shortage in South Carolina. So kind of one of my goals was to look at materials that use less shell or use it more efficiently or don't use shell. So yeah. Some of the criteria I use to evaluate the different products and methods that I've looked at is, first of all, how effective is it? Does it actually recruit oyster spat? Does it accrete any sediment and kind of build up that shoreline? Does it attenuate waves? So does it kind of dissipate that wave energy as it's coming in from like storms and hurricanes and all of those things? We face that in South Carolina. The cost, I kind of did a relative cost estimate because I didn't get specific price ranges for every product that I found. So I have like a little dollar sign range on each product, and it's like $1 sign to $4 signs. The cheapest methods are less than $100 per linear foot of installation, and the most expensive one is about $1,400 per linear foot, which is definitely an outlier, but that's why we have, yeah. So that would be like $4 signs. So there's kind of a range. That's why I did like the relative cost estimate. And then where areas has it been tested? Because South Carolina versus Florida can have different, environmental types, different sediment types, escarpments and slope. How steep is the slope, and will the product work if it's, a flat slope versus a steep slope? Those are all very important in knowing if it'll work in South Carolina. Does it contain plastics and contaminants? Some concretes can leach harmful substances into the water. So if we can avoid that, it's the best way to do it. If we can avoid plastic materials, it's better. Is local manufacturing possible? So some of these things you could probably make in your backyard. Others need to be manufactured far away overseas, or some of them you can create a mold and use local contractors. So what's that look like? Is self-installation possible, or is using volunteer labor possible? And finally, is the aesthetic. I think this one's especially important for property owners and in the lens of like looking at this new permit, because if you are putting out a living shoreline or an erosion control method on your property, you don't want it to like block your waterfront view. You want to be able to use it to attract more fish to your property, so you can fish off your pier and have it look pretty. So aesthetic is definitely an important factor. I've kind of split the presentation into methods that recruit oysters and accrete sediment, and then ones that accrete sediment but don't necessarily recruit oysters. So first part of the presentation is the ones that do recruit oysters and accrete sediment. So first up is Atlantic Reef Maker. So this is a product that is made of fiberglass rebar pilings, and then they stack these concrete discs on them. So the concrete gives that rough surface that attracts the oysters, and the pilings are super helpful for things like if you're having soft sediments, if it's super muddy. Sometimes it's easy for things to sink down in that mud and not be super effective once it sinks down low enough. You can use longer pilings and kind of anchor it in place. That way it works in softer sediments. You can accommodate for sea level rise with these, which is pretty cool. You can like lengthen the piling so that it's elevated up above, and you can put more concrete discs on top to add and account for that. These attenuate wave energy really, really well. So if this is an area that is affected by hurricanes and storms really badly, this is a good option. The concrete discs kind of dissipate that wave energy to either side. Marine life is able to move in between the units, which is really nice. But these are very heavy and you can't just go out in your backyard and install these very easily. So professionals and heavy equipment is required. They're also more expensive than others because of that contractor necessity to install it. And aesthetically, they are very large and, kind of bulky, and it takes longer for the oysters to fully cover them up and, make them blend into the environment. You can kind of see here, these are like bag shells versus the more like higher profile Atlantic Reef Makers. So second is Beast Products. So these are meant to be a replacement for the plastic mesh bags that we've been using to make oyster bags. So these are biodegradable. They have two types of bags. One is made of cellulose, and the second is made of like a biopolymer. The cellulose bags typically last 1 to 3 months when they're out in the field, which is not a super long time to recruit oysters and fully build it up. So sometimes by the time it breaks down, it kind of loses that structure because all the oyster shells just kind of fall loose and it doesn't help keep the structure as much. So people have had issues with that. Also practically when you're storing them, if you store them and they get exposed to the elements, the rain, they can break down even quicker before you even get it in the water. So they can be tricky, but they're the same process, same size, same weight as regular bagged shells. So that's an advantage that we already know how to use them. They are more expensive typically than the plastic mesh bags. They're 55 to 78% more expensive. And the short lifespan is definitely a disadvantage. And it also uses the same amount of oyster shells as we're already using. So the goal of minimizing oyster shell doesn't really apply to this. The biopolymer bags, which are the pink ones down there, it's kind of their newer product, and they're saying that it'll last 5 to 15 years in the field, but right now they're still testing it in the field, so it's not confirmed that that lifespan is accurate. But they have tested the cellulose bags, which are on top, and those do last about 2 months in the field. So next is articulated concrete blocks. So there are different brands that produce these called like Fleximat and Shoreflex are examples of that. So these essentially are plastic grids that connect little concrete blocks in like a grid system. So you would take contractors, they would kind of roll out this grid over the shoreline. And these are really great because they work in soft sediments because they have such a wide surface area. They're not going to like sink down and be heavy in one spot. The concrete blocks, especially at the toe of the shorelines, like right where it meets the water, that's where it's going to recruit the most oysters. It also creates sediments really well because it kind of gets caught in between those concrete blocks. As the wave washes up, it kind of leaves the sediment there. In between the concrete blocks, you can plant marsh grass if you have plants, little sprigs of plantings, or it'll grow in naturally over time anyway. It doesn't work with super steep slopes like some other products because it's been tested and doesn't really work there, but they are heavy and you cannot install these yourselves. And also that grid that's underlying the concrete blocks is plastics. That's a disadvantage. These are usually about $100 to $400 per linear foot for installing them. So it's kind of a medium price range. Yeah, these have been tested mostly in Georgia by their DNR service. They're still kind of seeing how effective they are. They've been out there for like less than a year at their test site. So we're still kind of waiting to see the verdict on how effective they are. E-concrete is an interesting one. they sell this concrete admixture. So you would take this and regular like box store concrete and do like 10% of this, 90% of regular concrete, mix it together. And it's supposed to make the concrete mixture more chemically balanced, which the con is that they don't really have a ton of documentation on what that means. I'm assuming it would mean it's more pH neutral and it's not leaching as many chemicals, but there's not a ton of details on like how it works and how it accomplishes that. It would be great if we could use this because some of the products that I'll talk about later, which is Pro and Posh modules, we could use it for that. You could use it for all these DIY projects, for the crab trap recycled like things that DNR are doing. You could use these to coat the galvanized wire with concrete and it would be less environmentally damaging. They're also versatile. You can use it in a ton of different ways. But again, it's not really sure how they work super well chemically. And then I also did not get a cost estimate from them. So they were not super responsive. Grow Oyster Reef is an interesting company too. So they produce calcium carbonate concrete. So this concrete is like 85% calcium carbonate. That's what oyster shells are made of. So they produce that concrete and they make it into these reef tiles. So that's what the picture is. It has a lot of rough surfaces and weird, like uneven tiers of surfaces that recruits oysters really well because they like those tiny little spaces they can get into and grow on. It also has these interstitial holes in the reef tiles. So you can add marsh grass plantings in it or, you know, allow other plants to come up through it. So the design is pretty interesting. They can also adjust the design of the bottom of the tile depending on if you have a sandy or a soft sediment. So if you have a site that's super sandy, this would work fine. But if you have a site that's super muddy and you're worried that this 28-pound concrete thing is going to sink down, they can adjust the bottom so that it's flatter and it's not going to sink and like increase that surface area. So it's nice that you can.
That's big.
It is big.
When I was looking at it, I was like,
Yeah, it looks tiny on the pictures, but
this big, really,
yeah,
like this big.
yeah. They cost between $35 and $50 per tile. So and they also don't, the main downside is we wouldn't be able to manufacture them locally. They would all have to be trucked in from Virginia and they are pretty lightweight. So there's the potential for self-installing and using volunteer labor to install them. But yeah, it's nice that they've been used in a variety of areas. We kind of know how they work. And there is an example of these in Conway, South Carolina, actually. So we have like kind of a local example. So we know it works in this area. Yeah.
Where's it already been working, like along the coast?
Mostly the East Coast. So like
Virginia, North Carolina.
yeah, all the like bordering states of us. Yeah. Okay, Oyster Catcher is another pretty local example. They're produced in North Carolina and they've mostly been tested there, but they also have been deployed in South Carolina here, in Florida, kind of all up and down the East Coast. They're really taking off. They use jute plant fiber and then coat it in cement and then mold it into the shape that they want. They have a few different like types of shapes that they do. So this one is called a table. These are pretzels. That's like a string of them. So they're all bunched together. And these bottom two are pillows. So it's kind of like a big log and then it has this extra jute fiber exposed inside. So again, you have this like fuzzy plant coating covered in concrete. It's got a lot of rough surface area for the oysters to attach to. So it recruits oyster spat really well. Since you have so many different shapes and arrangements, you can put it in almost any type of slope or any type of sediment, because if you have soft sediment, you can kind of stack them and tier them. You can have some that are up high, some that are down low. You can kind of hammock the pretzels underneath the tables to get more surface area. There's a lot of ways to like combine these different shapes and make it more effective depending on the area that's being installed in. It's been shown in peer-reviewed studies to be more effective at slowing shoreline erosion than bagged shells, which is what we've been using. So that's a pretty good mark in its favor. The table units, which are these guys, weigh about 30 pounds, so they're not super heavy. So they could be installed by property owners and, you know, things like that. They've survived Hurricane Ian and they blend into the environment pretty quickly after being installed, because within a year they'll have their entire surface covered in oyster spat. So, yeah, they are only manufactured in North Carolina right now. They're being studied in Georgia currently, like by their DNR services. It's been installed in a lot of private property owners' land in those other states. And this one's less than $100 per linear foot installed. So it's a pretty affordable option and very like proven to work. I can see that there's some chat. I do not know the specific dimensions of the grow oyster reefs.
But for the virtual people, we said about.
We said about kind of an arm's circle amount. Yeah, they weigh about 28 pounds of concrete. And then the other question was, are the grow oyster reefs and oyster castles manufactured by the same company? I don't think they are. Grow Oyster Reefs is a separate startup, as far as I know. I don't know if they have a working relationship or not, but it was started by a separate person. Okay, try to keep an eye on the chat, I guess. Okay, so next product is Natrix. This one comes out of North Carolina. It's kind of interesting because they use a 3D printing method they put concrete into their 3D printer and then make these shaped concrete units. So yeah, these are interesting because they have a satellite monitoring system where they can evaluate the site before they make the product. So if you have your piece of land and you're working with them, they'll take their satellites, monitor the fetch, the wind speed, the water speed, all of those things for a few weeks. And then based on that information, decide how to shape and how to compose the concrete that they're going to use for the products. So it's very personalized, which is cool. So it's tailored to whatever environmental conditions you're dealing with, sediment type, the slope, all of those things. It is pretty expensive. On average, it's about $200 per linear foot. So it's about double some of the other ones we've seen. And that's not including the cost for contractors, for installation. Some of these are really large. The average size that they gave me was 3 feet by 3 feet and weighing 500 pounds a piece. So that is large. A lot of areas will need a barge to actually like boat these in. And so it can get costly. But I think the monitoring technology is interesting, especially for government agencies wanting to see how effective all of these methods are, because they're able to like go back and look at their sites and measure how much accretion there is at each of their sites they've installed at. So I think that's an interesting avenue for the future. Marine mattresses are more of like a industrial, it's pretty commonly used by like engineers that are hired to deal with erosion control. So it does recruit oysters. It's very effective at sediment accretion. We have an example at Hilton Head. It's at the Port Royal Sound, I believe. So essentially it's a plastic geotextile. So it's like these plastic cage things that are filled with rocks, and then you top them with riprap, which is like larger stones on top to kind of keep it in place. It does require contractors and heavy equipment because these are very large structures. The mirroring mattresses themselves and a lot of the riprap would need to be sourced elsewhere. And they are pretty large and bulky when you install them, but I wanted to show you some example pictures of the Hilton Head example. So this was installed in 2006 and these photos are from 2012. So you can see it has accreted lots of sediment around it, and then lots of oyster shells have kind of recruited to it. The structure that's like beneath the like little grid underneath, that is extra geotextile to keep it from scouring out sand underneath it as the waves kind of pull sediment away from it. So it keeps it in place and keeps it from getting dug out underneath. So you can see it like blends in after a few years. So at first it starts out pretty bulky, but it pretty quickly blends in. Quick reef, these are concrete blocks that are 90 pounds. They're like a foot by 2.5 feet by 5 inches. So they're made of 10% Portland cement, and then the rest is made of limestone, pieces of oyster shell. There's something going on down there. And then, yeah, so it's mostly made of like limestone and these more natural products. So it's not going to be as disruptive to the chemical environment of the ocean. it recruits oyster spat really well because that limestone and those pieces of oyster shell really make a rough surface. It has withstood Hurricane Ian, one of the sites that they looked at in North Carolina. After Hurricane Ian, they went out and assessed the site, and I think one block had been moved out of place. The rest of it was intact. So it has, proven to stand up to storm and wave energy. But there's not a ton of studies on the long-term performance of it. Also, installation requires a contractor because they have to be placed in this like pyramidal fashion. You have kind of a row of these quick reef blocks in the middle, and then you stack them on either side. The blocks need to be trucked in, and then they're pretty tall off the ground, so they do take a little while longer to blend into the environment, but once they do, it's covered up pretty nice. They're installed in a lot of places throughout North Carolina, so we have local examples to look at. Gabion baskets, these are essentially galvanized wire cages that you can buy, and then you fill them with either rock or oyster shells or both, depending on who's doing it. They have a really long lifespan, which is nice. And then there's no plastic involved, which is another pro. The Georgia DNR and then North Carolina Coastal Federation have both kind of been playing around with these the past few years and looking at how well they work and everything. A lot of both groups noticed that they kind of popped open at the corners in some of the sites, and then there were some concerns about wildlife impacts. So they noticed some fish in the Georgia DNR site specifically getting trapped in the cages. So that started them worrying about diamondback terrapins and other kind of sensitive species. There were also concerns about it impeding reproduction of like horseshoe crabs because it kind of blocks them from getting up to shore. So that's kind of a concern that has not quite been dealt with yet. And next section is products that don't recruit oysters but do accrete sediments. So wave attenuating devices. This one is our pricing outlier. This is the one that is $1,400 a linear foot. They are really, really effective at attenuating wave energy. That's like what they're designed for, hence the name. So these WAD structures, they're like pyramid concrete structures. They're huge. They're like 8,000 pounds. They have these little triangles, holes in them. So as a wave comes through and it goes through these triangles, the angles of where the concrete walls are inside slows down the wave. So then sediment that's in the wave, like sand and stuff that's mixed in, kind of falls down and then accretes behind it. So it slows down the waves really well. So at higher energy environments, it's really great. It does not recruit oysters super well. And basically what they do is they design a steel mold and then they send it to a local manufacturer. So someone in South Carolina could produce the concrete blocks. They would use that steel mold, put in the concrete and then produce it. But yeah, you would still need a professional to install that because it's very, very heavy. They are quite large as well, and they don't typically blend into the environment super quickly. So Silt Socks Natural Plus. So this is a company called Filtrex. They make these, it's typically used for construction actually, to like keep like hillsides from eroding, but they have this biodegradable mesh. It's made of like a wood fiber. They have one also that's made of cotton fiber, and that one kind of breaks down pretty easily, but the wood fiber one seems to be pretty sturdy so far. It's supposed to have an estimated lifetime of 18 months. That's in a construction setting. So in an intertidal setting, it would likely be shorter. But yeah, it's biodegradable, so there's no like plastic components to it. It accretes sediments pretty well. I was thinking it could be kind of an alternative to using core logs, those coconut fiber logs that we use in South Carolina, because it would have a similar shape, size, function. And yeah, so the installation would probably be possible for property owners. But yeah, the cotton fiber ones broke open out in the field. The wood fiber versions of this sock has not had that problem. But yeah. Next is geotubes. These are essentially big plastic tubes that you install on the side of a shoreline and you fill them with sediment. You can use local sediment, so local sand, local dirt, compost material. You can use these at steep slopes and escarpments because it kind of just shapes to that shape of the shoreline. You can get aprons, is what they call them, like pieces of material put underneath it to prevent scouring. They are filled with sediment, so plants can grow through them, which is nice. And that kind of anchors it in place and kind of makes it blend into the environment eventually. They also have a pretty nice aesthetic value because eventually they do get covered up with plants and sand and sediment. It takes a little while, but once those plants get in there, it really starts accreting sediment. But the bags are made of plastic, which is not ideal. And they've mostly been tested in sandy areas, so like beachy areas, not necessarily the muddy marsh areas that we would be potentially using them for. And also to fill it with sediment, you have to use these really high powered like water guns to kind of fill it and compress it down. I see a couple chat things. Is silt socks the same as the aspen socks DNR tested? I do not know if it's the same, but
You can chime in now.
yeah, it might be similar because it's made of a wood fiber and they do fill it with like wooden chips, so it might be similar. Similar, that product was called Curlex. They did not last long. Okay. So probably similar product, but different brand. So yeah, geotubes. They're going to be inherently more expensive because you need contractors to kind of install them. But I didn't get a specific estimate on that pricing. There we go. Envirolock growth bags are kind of similar to geotubes, except it's more of a series of smaller bags. So you can stack them, you can layer them so that they fit along a shoreline. So even if it's really steep, you can stack them along. Yeah, they also accrete sediment really well and you can grow plants out of them. So it takes almost no time for it to grow out and blend into the environment. There's not a ton of backfill or like equipment needed to install them. So it'd be a little bit easier. You wouldn't need as much like heavy equipment. Yeah. And the material also for this one, similar to the geotubes, is made of a plastic, made of like a bioethylene plastic. So that's not ideal. And then the bags would have to be shipped in. You can use local sediment to fill it, so that's nice, but the bags have to be shipped in. And we do have a local example in Kiowa Island. This picture is not from Kiowa, but we do have like these installed in Kiowa. So
are they being successful in Kiowa at the moment? I mean, are they meeting expectations or?
I got the impression they were. Yeah. So Socks Erosion Solutions is another company that makes kind of this similar bag, but their shore socks and dredge socks material is instead designed to be more like a taco than a sock. So you can kind of see they have like the little divots of the material at this top picture. They anchor and place the bottom, they kind of scoop it down, fill it with sediment, and then anchor the top of it. So it's kind of like a taco. So these are nice because you can actually cut them and shape them along the shoreline to avoid trees and avoid posts. So you don't have to clear as much land to make room for it, which is nice. Also, you can cut holes in this without it like tearing any further and plant plants in it. You can also dry seed it from the inside, which is nice. So like those plants really come up pretty easily. They've been used before to replace failing bulkheads, which that's kind of the alternative to living shorelines and erosion control methods, is like these heavy metal, like industrial construction methods, and those eventually fail. So this has been a way to replace those. And yeah, Sock Shoreline Solutions has like some sort of training that contractors can go through to install them. So we could use local contractors, which is nice. But again, these are made of a layered plastic material and the product itself is not manufactured locally. Yeah, these range from $90 to $160 per linear foot. So they're like pretty affordable. And then the last section is not proprietary options. So these aren't made by a company. They're kind of open source. Anybody can make them. That's the last part I've included. The first one is Pervious Oyster Shell Habitat, which is the POSH modules. So these were developed by the University of North Florida Biolab, and they were meant to kind of be an alternative to the plastic mesh bags that they've been using to fill with oyster shells and do living shorelines, because these don't actually use any plastic material. So you can just make them in your backyard. They have published open source instructions on how to make the molds. what types of concrete to use, all the measurements and how to make them. They usually come out to about $20 per unit. So again, they are like pretty sizable units. They recruit oysters really well because essentially they use regular concrete. You can use admixtures to make the pH more neutral for the ocean and like the surrounding areas, but they use, instead of aggregate, they use oyster shell in the concrete mixture. So that's why it has all these oyster shells kind of coated in the concrete. It recruits really well because it has all these uneven surfaces and it's coated in this rough concrete. But the only downside is it doesn't replace the use of recycled oyster shells. You're still using oyster shells, and since we have a shortage, we're trying to find ways to minimize it. It also is not very good at holding up to storms and accreting sediment, but in an area where oysters are your priority, this might be a good option. The units are typically 30 to 50 pounds a piece. So pretty sizable, but able to like self-install. They've used in Florida, they've had little events where they like had volunteers install living shorelines with this, and they use like middle schoolers to help install it, so it's pretty accessible. But yeah. And then lastly is plastic-free restoration of oyster shorelines, PROS. They love the big long acronyms for these products. But again, this one's not proprietary. It's not produced by a company. These are jute fiber erosion control mats that usually you would put over the ground to keep it from mud and things like that from getting swept away by rain or whatever. But instead they coat them in concrete, or they use grout only instead of concrete. So it's more pH neutral. And then, so they coat it in this grout and then fold it into these like pyramidal log formations, and then let it dry. So it forms these pyramid shapes. So again, these have been used in like volunteer events and stuff in Florida. The grout makes it like a more neutral pH, which is beneficial. So it's not like leaching as much basic chemicals into the water. It does recruit oysters really well, and it accretes sediment really well. It doesn't attenuate wave energy much, so it's not going to help with like storms and things like that. But overall, another interesting option. And that is my full list of products. I have some more that are listed in the actual document that I produced, but any questions for now?
So knowing that you're not the subject matter expert, if you had to pick your 3 favorites that you researched and you were like, "Ooh, this might be really good for us," what would you pick?
I think the oyster catcher is a really interesting one, just because there's so many ways you can combine the different shapes and use it at so many different sites, and it's relatively cheap. Also the Posh modules, since you can kind of make them in your backyard and it's really accessible, it seems kind of similar to how DNR does volunteer events to put out bag shell and does the like manufactured wire reefs where they put everything together. It seems like it'd be really good for having community event opportunities like that. Same with the PROS too. And I think the Natrix is really cool just because they have the satellite system, and they don't do this now, but I think it'd be a cool option if they did, where they like contracted out just the satellite services to evaluate sites. And if like DNR could contract Natrix to evaluate the different test sites that they have and measure the accretion rates and measure how effective they are, I think that'd be a really interesting way to incorporate that technology. So yeah. Any other questions in here?
Remind us again what, like, how this is going to get to the people who decide what's possible for use.
Yeah.
That's a Rachel question or your question.
So basically I have all of this and some more products compiled in a document with like more detailed descriptions on them, and all the different like studies that have backed it up, or, you know, just all the different information I could find on it. So those are going to be sent out to the people that like DNR, DHEC, Nature Conservancy, people like those. And it's just so that they can have options to look into it in the future. So
Yeah,
hopefully.
and a lot of them are on the call right now. So, and an email saying that they can't attend and want the recording. So,
Yeah, and hopefully, hopefully, if any of these are useful and the research backs it up enough and we can try them out in South Carolina and prove that they work, they could potentially be added on to the DHEC permit and property owners would be allowed to utilize those. Because right now they're only sticking with what they know has been tested here. So this is just to kind of give them new options to work with and try out. Then let's see. Some of the questions on here. Did you research the use of recycled concrete, like if they're demolishing bridges, runways, etc.? I did read a few articles that talked about using recycled concrete. So if they like demolish a building, using the concrete from the foundations and stuff to put it out, kind of riprap style, just chunks of concrete out on the shoreline. And I know the major concern with that is all of the potential chemical leaching, since it's like construction grade concrete, and also just being in a construction site, it's getting exposed to all these oils and like contaminants potentially. So I know that was a big concern with that. And I didn't find any specific methods that were official that use that. Like, this is the method to use concrete. This is how you standardize it. It is being tried in a lot of places, but I know that's a big concern, is the chemicals that are involved in that. Which method do you think has the most promise for widespread use in South Carolina? I think oyster catcher, again, is kind of really good potential for widespread use, just because it's already used so prevalently along the East Coast, and it's already used on like private property in South Carolina. We talked to an oyster farmer who has used it on his property, and it's been doing well, and it's in the Charleston area. So I think that has a really good potential for like widespread use. And then, have you run these materials by DHEC to see the potential for use in the future? No, so that's kind of what the document is meant for, is to kind of give them that information and let them run with it and decide. Yeah.
And so the one that you keep talking about, the
Oyster catcher.
sorry, I was gonna call it the other one, oyster catcher. So cost effective, I'm sorry, I'm trying to remember all the things.
Yeah.
Cost effective, yeah, can you?
Yeah, definitely.
It's the one that was like you could put it in the different shapes.
And I will say I'm biased towards this one because I got to see it in person.
That was the table, yeah. Yeah.
Oh, it just went to the other one. Yeah. Yes, this was that one.
You put it up, and okay, so aesthetic value, retreat sediment, it's cost effective. Polars can do it, and then wave.
Attenuation.
I
Yeah.
think they're gonna call it the wrong thing.
Yeah.
It helps with wave attenuation, so it kind of, other than the fact that it's not created here, it checks all the boxes.
Yeah, it seems like the most accessible thing for property owners, especially in terms of the
it
permit.
doesn't leach anything into the water from the.
I think it depends on the type of concrete they use. I know they've worked with different admixtures to like affect the pH and affect what's leaching from it. So there is some risk for that, which I think they've been looking into. And it was started by a professor at Chapel Hill, so.
Maybe somebody wants to unmute.
Yeah. Let's see. Are they all forcibly muted right now?
Maybe we just, if anyone wants.
Oh,
to
okay.
unmute and ask a question, go for it.
Yeah, if you have a question, you can just speak out.
Hi, it's Joy. Can you hear me?
Hey, Joy.
Kind of a random question, but so if this was your favorite, was there any kind of tangential research to see the potential to have this jute fiber made from plants that are coming from South Carolina?
So I've definitely wondered about that, and I think it could be a potential for South Carolina, especially because the pros modules, let me go back towards the end, which was one of the non-proprietary products. It's also made of jute fiber, but it's made out of the erosion control mat. So there is potential, I think, for them to play around with it and find jute fiber or other South Carolina native plant fibers that we could use and kind of support South Carolina economy by kind of making this. I'm sure there would be copyright issues and licensing things to take into consideration, but I do think there's potential for that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions on the Zoom or in here? All right. Well, first of all, I definitely wanted to thank Coastal Conservation League as a whole for allowing me to have this position this spring and take 15 weeks and just dive deep into researching oysters. And I never thought I would know this much about oysters and shoreline improvement, but even just taking a walk at the West Ashley Greenway, they have bricks along some of the shorelines, and just like noticing things when I go places now, and like the groins and at Folly Beach, like I just find myself noticing these things a lot more and thinking about it critically. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to have done this internship. Everybody in the office is like so nice and so welcoming, and I really appreciate being welcomed into this space for the past 15 weeks. I want to thank Rachel especially for being my mentor and guiding me through this process of like cold emailing dozens of people and being like, hey, I have some questions. Definitely South Carolina DNR, the SCORE program. I did some volunteer events with them, so that was great. Being able to talk to professionals, the Nature Conservancy, North Carolina Coastal Federation, Georgia's DNR department, all these different state agencies have really been super helpful and open about what methods they have tried, what's worked and not worked. A lot of representatives from the different businesses have taken the time to speak with me, so big shout out and thank you to all of those people. And yeah, after this, we'll be sending out a follow-up email with the recording of the presentation, the full version of my document with all of the attributes listed, and then an abbreviated version that's bullet pointed and a little easier to read. And then we also will be sending out this little one-pager, which is meant for kind of passing out to property owners. So all of those will be sent out in that email as well. And yeah, thank you guys for coming out. Things on the chat.
And Abby has a job.
I do have a job. Thank you. So I will be moving to Massachusetts soon, which is exciting. Big move, but
What's the position?
I'll be a fisheries observer. So I'll be going out on commercial fishing boats and sampling their catches and reporting that data. My company that I'll be working for is contracted by NOAA. So they'll be getting that information to NOAA and having them and the National Marine Fisheries Service like use that to inform policies that they're making. So I'm really excited. Yeah. Thank you guys. And
Escape the next top block.
okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Abby. That was so interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Look at all these great jobs. I love
Thank you guys for zooming in.
So nice.